She would sit by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the sun sink low over the sea. The colors of the sky would bleed into each other, shades of orange, pink, and purple, and for a moment she would lose herself in the beauty of the world. But then her thoughts would return to her sons, to the love she had poured into them, and to the knowledge that something precious was slipping through her fingers. The sorrow that weighed on her heart was quiet, hidden behind the smiles she wore for the world. No one knew the pain she carried, not even Celestine. She had always been the emotional center of their family, the one who kept everything together with quiet grace. But now the cracks in the foundation of their home were too large to ignore. The love they had once shared was still there, but it was frayed and thin, like the nets that had weathered too many storms. In the long, quiet nights when the sounds of the village had softened and the stars dotted the sky like a million tiny eyes watching over them, Lena would wonder how things had gone wrong. Was it her fault? Was it Celestine's? Or had it been inevitable? Part of the tides of life, the shifting currents that none of them could control. She didn't have the answers. All she knew was that the family she had once known, united by love, laughter, and shared dreams, was no longer the same. And in her heart, a quiet dread began to take root, the fear that the distance between her sons could never be bridged again. But still, she held on. Because what else could she do? As the seasons passed, the fracture between Michael and Paul became more evident. The rift between them was no longer a quiet thing, hidden behind closed doors. It was now part of the fabric of their lives, woven into every conversation, every look, every moment of silence between them. The family was still together, but it felt as though something precious had been lost forever. And Celestine, who had weathered every storm the sea had thrown at him, found himself facing a storm he could not navigate. The love he had for his sons, for his family, had been tested, and he feared that the rift between them might be too deep to heal. The storm. One fateful winter, as the winds howled like wolves over the restless sea, Celestine fell ill. It wasn't the gentle decline of old age, where time slowly claimed the body and mind in quiet surrender. This sickness was different. It was fierce, unrelenting, a savage force that seemed to have risen from the very depths of the ocean Celestine had spent his life navigating. It consumed him from the inside out, draining his strength and will with every passing day. The village of Egipto, so accustomed to the sight of Celestine standing tall by his boat, was thrown into disarray. The sea had always been a constant in their lives, but now it felt as though the tide itself had turned against the man who had once commanded it with ease. His family watched in helpless horror as he withered away. The hospital, a sterile, foreign place to a man who had spent his entire life under the vast sky, was no comfort. The scent of antiseptic replaced the tang of salt air, and the quiet hum of machines replaced the rhythmic crash of waves on the shore. The walls, cold and white, seemed to close in on Celestine, stripping him of his dignity and his strength. It was a world he had never known, a world he could not understand. Michael, the steady son, remained by his father's side. Every day he sat in that cold, fluorescent-lit room, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his gaze never leaving Celestine's frail form. He was there through every moment, silent, unwavering, a constant presence in the storm that had overtaken their family. In the face of his father's decline, Michael had no choice but to be strong. The sea had taught him to endure, and now it was his father who needed that same endurance. But for Paul, things were different. The storm that had torn through the family in the years before now had a physical manifestation in his absence. He came to the hospital sporadically, never with the regularity or devotion Michael showed. His visits were infrequent, and when he did show up, he carried an air of guilt and bitterness that only seemed to deepen the divide between him and his family. Celestine's illness was a mirror, one that reflected the fractured state of the family. The man who had once been the pillar of strength for his sons now lay helpless, his body failing him with every passing day. Michael, who had always been the dutiful son, could only watch in silent sorrow. Paul, however, avoided his father's side, avoiding the raw vulnerability that hung in the air like a storm cloud. His guilt was too heavy, the weight of his estrangement too great to face. He had chosen the path of rebellion, a life that no longer had room for the man who had raised him, and it seemed that the more he tried to avoid the hospital, the more he felt trapped in the mistakes of his past. One evening, as the sun began its descent into the sea, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Celestine felt a sudden clarity. The endless pain of his sickness, the weariness of his bones, and the knowledge that his time was nearing its end made him realize there was one thing he could still control. A final act of love, a last attempt to ensure his sons would find their way back to each other, even after he was gone. He called for his lawyer. The lawyer was an old friend from the city, a man who had helped Celestine in the past with various matters of business. They had known each other for years, ever since Celestine had bought the plots of land in the bustling city, a legacy, something beyond the sea, for his sons to inherit one day. Celestine had always been a man of action, but in these final days, he found his mind and heart drawn to one singular thought: his sons. They had been the foundation of his life, and he could no longer stand by and watch their bond fracture beyond repair. The lawyer arrived at the hospital, his presence a sharp contrast to the soft murmur of machines and the quiet shuffle of nurses' footsteps. He was a man of efficiency, with a precise, no-nonsense manner that did not match the warmth of Celestine's home or the intimate family life that had once defined them. He sat by Celestine's bed, listening as the old fisherman, frail but still sharp in his mind, spoke with a quiet urgency. "I need you to help me, my friend," Celestine said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I know my time is short, but before I go, I want to make sure my sons, both of them, are taken care of." The lawyer nodded, already understanding the weight of this request. He had seen the rift between the two sons, had witnessed the tension that now hung in the air whenever the family gathered. "I know it may not make sense to them now," Celestine continued, his eyes glassy with exhaustion, but fierce with determination. "But I want them to have what they need. The land's in the city. They're for Michael. He has always been the steady one, the one who carries the weight without question. He will know what to do with them. But Paul?" Celestine's voice softened at the mention of his younger son. "Paul needs the land in Egypto, the land here. It may not be as valuable in money, but it's where his roots are. It's where his mother walks, where his father learned the ways of the sea. I want him to have it, for it to be his anchor." The lawyer, ever the professional, took careful notes, but he couldn't help but feel the sadness that hung in the room. Celestine, a man who had weathered countless storms at sea, was now facing the greatest storm of all, the divide between his sons, one that seemed insurmountable. And yet in his final moments, he still tried to bridge the gap, to offer each of them what they needed, even if they couldn't see it. "I will carry out your wishes," the lawyer said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet empathy. "But you know, Celestine, there may be more to this than just the land. It's the bond, the love. You cannot force them to love each other after you're gone." Celestine's eyes grew distant, the pain of his illness evident in his furrowed brow. He nodded slowly, understanding the lawyer's words, but unwilling to accept their finality. "I know," he whispered, "but I have to try. Perhaps they will see it in time." The lawyer didn't speak again, for there was nothing more to say. He took the signed will, folded it carefully, and placed it in the envelope Celestine had requested. The sun was now low in the sky, and Celestine, the great fisherman who had once ruled the tides, closed his eyes. There was nothing more he could do, except let the tide carry him where it would. Days passed, and Celestine's condition worsened. The hospital room grew quieter, the once familiar sounds of life now replaced by the hollow beep of the heart monitor and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet. Michael remained by his father's side, a constant presence, his heart heavy with the weight of both grief and responsibility. He knew that when his father was gone, the burden of carrying the family legacy would fall to him. It was a role he had always accepted, but now it felt like a suffocating weight. Paul, meanwhile, stayed away. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was easier to stay distant, easier to pretend that his father's illness was just another thing that didn't concern him. The love that had once been so pure between him and Celestine now felt tainted by years of rebellion and failure. Every visit he made to the hospital seemed to carry with it the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies, and each time he turned his back before those words could escape. Celestine's passing came quietly, like the fading of the tide with no dramatic moment, no final words spoken. It was the kind of death he had always feared, silent, unremarkable, slipping away before anyone could truly prepare for it. The sea had claimed him in the end, just as it had always claimed its own. But what Celestine left behind in his final act was a question. Could his sons, Michael, the Rock, and Paul, the wild spirit, ever find their way back to one another? Could the storm that had torn them apart be weathered once again? The answers would not come easily, nor would they come soon. But in his heart, Celestine had hoped they would. Chapter 4. The Will. Days after Celestine passed away, Egypto felt like a village that had been drained of its spirit. The sea still whispered against the shore, the waves crashing as they always had, but the place where Celestine's laughter and stories had once filled the air now stood eerily silent. His boat sat abandoned in the harbor, its hull weathered but sturdy, much like the man who had once commanded it. The village felt the loss in a way they had never expected, because it wasn't just Celestine who was gone. It was the heart of Egypto itself. In the small house on the edge of the village, the family gathered for the reading of Celestine's will. The air was thick with grief, but beneath it was something darker, a tension that had been building for years, a fracture that had deepened with every passing day. Lena, her face drawn with the weight of sorrow, sat between her two sons. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the thin veins in her fingers trembling. The years of caring for her family had not made her weary in body, but they had certainly aged her spirit. Her gaze flickered from one son to the other, unable to mask the worry that pulled in her eyes. Michael, always the steady son, sat with his back straight, his expression calm and unreadable. He had spent the last few days focusing on what needed to be done, trying to keep some sense of order in a house that was rapidly losing its form. He knew the will was coming, but he was unprepared for how it would feel, how the weight of Celestine's decisions would hit him now. His heart, though steady in its rhythm, was heavy with the realization that his father had taken this final act without consulting him or anyone else. Paul, on the other hand, was visibly on edge. His leg bounced nervously, the sound of his restless tapping filling the tense silence. His hands were clenched in fists, his eyes darting from the will to his mother to Michael. It was as if the finality of Celestine's death had cracked something in him, and he was struggling to contain the chaos inside. He wanted answers, explanations that would give him the right to feel something other than the gnawing emptiness inside. The lawyer, a man who had known Celestine for decades, cleared his throat and began to read. His voice was steady, professional, but even he couldn't escape the gravity of the situation. Celestine, having full faith in his sons, leaves his legacy as follows. To Michael, his 5 valuable plots of land in the bustling city, and to Paul, his 3 plots of land in Egypto, the land of their ancestors. The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their meaning. Michael, who had always assumed he would inherit his father's full legacy, sat motionless for a long moment. He had been prepared for this, at least in theory. His father had been ill for some time, and Celestine had always talked about wanting Michael to continue his work. But hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing that his father had so deliberately chosen him for the city lands and Paul for the village lands, felt like a sudden gust of wind knocking him off balance. Michael's hand instinctively reached for the arm of his chair, his fingers tightening, but he didn't speak. The truth was, he was stunned. He wasn't sure how to process it, how to reckon